Social 30-1, we're continuing our look with totalitarianism. We looked at the theory behind totalitarianism already. We looked at an example of totalitarianism in the form of Soviet Union under Stalin. Now we look at Nazi totalitarianism. Really good case study of totalitarianism in action because the Nazi experience was so dramatic and so extreme that it's a great example of what can go wrong when a government can seize too much power. This happened in a really small time frame historically. So it's very dramatic, very extreme, great example of totalitarianism. When I was a kid, I used to think the word Nazi must mean something big, fancy, and meaningful. And it's not really. It's just the acronym for the National Socialist Party of Germany. Believe it or not, this is a socialist party on paper, but behind the scenes, this is about the most fascist, elitist organization you will ever see. But socialism had broad-based appeal in the 30s and the 20s. So rather than calling themselves the foaming at the mouth fascists, they tried to sell themselves as socialists. It's got broad-based universal appeal, but I think we know better. And you've probably seen this symbol a million times already, the swastika, red background with white and black as the focal point. In many cultures, the swastika is a symbol of good luck, of peace, and so on. The Nazis used it for their own purposes, um, but you'll see that image a lot when we look at the Nazis. So, the beginning of Nazi totalitarianism actually is rooted in the Treaty of Versailles. One could argue convincingly that if it weren't for the Treaty of Versailles, you would never have heard of the Nazis. You would never have heard of Adolf Hitler. And there's good reason for that. By the end of World War I, 1918, Germany had surrendered. They were the last country standing from the original Triple Alliance. So if you'll recall 20-1, Italy switched sides and joined the Triple Entente. Austria-Hungary left the war in 1917, and so all that really left was Germany from that original alliance package. And they lost the war by November of 1918, as you know, and were kind of ripe for the picking by the other countries because they were the last country standing from that side. And so when we look back, the Treaty of Versailles was very unfair to Germany. Um, you could argue they were scapegoated and blamed for World War I, when really, when you look at it from certain angles, all those countries could have been blamed for World War I, but because Germany lost, they're going to take the blame for World War I. So everything that happens because of it, when looking back, we would say it was unfair. Germany especially would have said that it was unfair. So one could say that the resentment that came out of the Treaty of Versailles is what allowed for the rise of the Nazis. And you could make a very convincing argument that way. So item number one of the Treaty of Versailles that we'll look at would be the war reparations. Germany had to pay $33 billion in reparations for World War I, which meant they paid the British, the French, and the countries that fought against Germany for World War I. In today's dollar figure, that $33 billion would be about $400 billion in today's money. And again, from Germany's perspective, why should they be blamed for World War I? It's unfair. Why should they be paying for World War I? That's going to bother them for a long time, and I don't blame them. Item number two is the war guilt clause. So Article 231 from the Treaty of Versailles basically said Germany must accept blame for World War I. They are now financially liable for World War I, even though, when you look at it from different perspectives, a lot of countries could have been blamed for World War I. Germany was demilitarized, so they were allowed, I think, an army of no more than 100,000 men, which at that time would have been not much more than a glorified police force. Don't forget, armies at this time numbered in the millions of people. Germany can have an army of no more than 100,000 men. They were allowed no air force whatsoever, and 6 antiquated naval vessels. That's all they were allowed. That was especially humiliating for Germany. Number one, how are they going to protect themselves? And number two, this was a country that had always invested a lot of its identity in its military. And you just said they can't have one, basically. So no wonder that didn't go over well with them. Finally, item number four is a big one for this part of the course. The Weimar Republic. Weimar is a city in Germany. Um, the Weimar Republic basically meant that Germany had to embrace a liberal democracy. Don't forget that upon its formation in 1871, Germany had always been a monarchy under Wilhelm I and later on Wilhelm II, the Kaisers of Germany. At the end of World War I, the German monarchy had disintegrated. The Kaiser fled the country. So by the time they get to the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Germany doesn't really have a government. And so the Allies, the Treaty of Versailles, the British, the French, the Americans, forced them to embrace the Weimar Republic, a democratic government for Germany that they did not want, that they would resent for the next dozen years. They never wanted the Weimar Republic. Whenever they thought of the Weimar Republic, it reminded them of World War I and the French, who are their arch rival at this time. And this is an important time in history because the Weimar Republic was never really accepted by the German population. And so what it meant was that for the 1920s, Germany was politically very unstable. The Weimar Republic wasn't strong. There was political disunity. We couple that with the economic collapse of 1923. And this was when, to pay off the reparations, the German government made the mistake of printing more money, which sounds like a good idea on paper. But when you print more money, all you do is devalue your currency. Again, the law of supply and demand means that the more there is of something, the less demand, the less it costs. And so if all you do is flood your market with money, you lower the value of that money, of that currency, which led to hyperinflation in Germany. And you should have learned this in 20-1. In March of 23, the month the mark went mad, they were printing bills with $1 billion on them. And all it meant was that their currency was so devalued it was worthless. People were literally buying loaves of bread with a wheelbarrow full of money. In many ways, the money had more value to be burnt as fodder than it did to buy anything. They solved the problem by calling the currency in, destroying it, and reissuing a new currency. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Weimar Republic destabilized Germany politically. Hyperinflation destabilized them economically, which meant that it was actually very possible, very plausible that an Adolf Hitler could come along and seize power because there was so much going wrong in Germany at that time. There was so much to blame that it was straightforward for an extreme leader like Hitler to come along and seize power in Germany. And at the root of those two crises, economic and political, was your Treaty of Versailles. Ironically enough, it was intended to stop and prevent World War II. And as we're going to find, it's one of the direct causes of World War II. Early on in 23, Hitler and the Nazis tried to take over the government in a coup, in a political coup. That was known as the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. It didn't work out. It was a disaster, if anything. People knew they were coming. There weren't a lot of them. They weren't overly well armed. So his first attempt at seizing power was a disaster. He was actually sent to prison for 5 years. He only served the 1 year in very comfortable surroundings. And during that 1 year, he wrote the infamous story, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Um, if people had read the book and taken it seriously at that time, they would have known what was about to happen. But again, he's still very much a fringe political figure. Few people read the book, and of those that did, very few took it seriously. Um, Too bad they didn't. His middle years involved a platform shift, so this is when he becomes, the fascist Nazi leader that we know of. A lot of his speeches were given in beer halls, and that's just what you did at that time. So these mass crowds of thousands of people, some of them had been drinking, and you went up and you gave your speech. He was a very good public speaker, very charismatic, kind of broke the mold in terms of political public speaking. A lot of energy, a lot of fire in the words that he had to say, the way he said them, the words that he chose. Many would say later, I was in a hall of 6,000 people. I thought he was talking to me. I thought he was speaking directly to me. He had the gift of public speaking, which helped his rise to power a lot. He employs his SA at this time, his stormtroopers, otherwise known as the brown shirts, because they wore brown shirts. There's a picture of one to the far right, and the SA were there to protect him. It was kind of his inner circle of people that he could trust for protection, because the things he's saying, his rhetoric is so far out there. He needs protection from bullies, from people looking for revenge, etc. That's why he had the SA. The Nazis enter a series of elections. Don't forget the Weimar Republic, after all, is a democracy, so they are having elections. 1928, the Nazis enter the election. They only get 2.6% of the popular vote. 1930, they get 18% of the popular vote. 1932, 37% of the popular vote. And now this is becoming meaningful and dangerous. In most Western European countries and Germany, the way they allocate seats in their parliament is based on the popular vote. So if you get 2.6% of the popular vote, you get 2.6% of the seats in their elected parliament, in their House of Commons, if you want to compare it to Canada. So in 1930, he's got 18% of the seats in parliament. And by 1932, he's got 37% of the seats in parliament. This is actually a lot under proportional representation. It means that his party is noteworthy. It's got a lot of credibility. It's on the verge of maybe even seizing power. He finally consolidates his power in 1933. He is named the Chancellor of the German coalition government. So he's basically their prime minister. But he doesn't have complete absolute power yet. He's still abiding by democracy. The Reichstag, German parliament, their House of Commons, mysteriously burns to the ground, or virtually to the ground, in February of 1933. No one knows what caused it. In April, he forms the Gestapo. I talked about this already. The Gestapo is his secret police. That is who is going to get rid of his political opposition. They have another election in March of 33, and now he's got a whopping 44% of the popular vote, which is a lot under proportional representation. The reasons for his rise in popularity, turns out that Reichstag fire was started by the Nazis. They started the fire and they blamed it on the communists. They said, hey, listen, we're on the verge of a communist revolution. Would you rather the communists in charge or us? Um, and many Germans felt they were playing it safe by voting for the communists. The bully tactics of the SA, bullying people into voting for the Nazis, would have helped. Don't forget, this is the 1930s. The Great Depression is alive and well. There's a lot of economic turmoil and trouble that he can use to blame other people for and rise to power. And people are preoccupied by the Great Depression. Maybe he kind of slipped through the crack. And finally, the crisis theory. The crisis theory basically says, listen, dictatorships don't just happen in any old country. There needs to be something really wrong with your country, politically, economically, or both. And Germany's got both. In March of 33, he opens the first of his concentration camps, Dachau. So this is where he begins to send his political prisoners. This is not a death camp. We're not there yet. But Dachau is the first of the concentration camps for his political opponents. And then in 33, he begins to consolidate his power rapidly. In March of 33, he passes the Enabling Act, Article 48. What it basically means is that he is appointed, he names himself dictator with absolute powers for an interim amount of time. And the thinking is that because so much is wrong, he will rule by decree rather than consensus and debate as the absolute dictator of Germany. And after he has averted the crisis, after he's got rid of the turmoil, he will bring back democracy and the Constitution. So he's going to temporarily suspend the German democratic constitution and rule as dictator. Believe it or not, the Reichstag parliament gives it the okay. Um, Seemed like a good idea at the time. He probably never intended to give back the democracy, but this is how he seized absolute power. So the Enabling Act is a big point in history. It's when he becomes the dictator of Germany. Many would say that he was fulfilling what is called the great man theory, which was built by a guy named Thomas Carlyle. He basically said, listen, a great man will step forward and lead your country to greatness. Many people saw Adolf Hitler as that great man. So, to a lot of people, he was the fulfillment of Carlyle's great man theory, and they were willing to follow along. Don't forget, they're blaming the Treaty of Versailles for all of this stuff. And then in April, right away, they turn on the Jews. They begin to boycott Jewish businesses. They attack the Jews in public. There is some protest from other countries, but not much, and it's very mild. In April of 33, he passes the Civil Service Law, which removes Jewish judges and lawyers. So any Jewish professional is fired from their job and they have to take on menial jobs that don't pay much and don't have much social status. He's trying to marginalize the Jews. That is his scapegoating target. That's who he's going to go after. That's who he's going to blame for Germany's problems. And again, we talked about this when we looked at totalitarianism in theory. You need a scapegoat. He's picked the Jews. And you'll understand why in a lesson I give you probably tomorrow. As well, in April, he passes an act that creates the Hitler Youth or the Hitler Jugend. It basically means that all national German organizations have to be Nazi in nature. It's a way for him to spread propaganda and indoctrinate the German youth. He wants to indoctrinate the youth, and if he does a really good job at indoctrinating that current generation, they will indoctrinate their kids, and so on and so on. In May, they begin a series of book burning rallies, which are more symbolic than anything. They basically burn anything that is non Germanic. Anything that contradicts Nazi propaganda is burned as a means of purifying their culture. If you've seen it, the third Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade, Indiana Jones is at a book burning rally in Berlin. In July of 33, he passes another law. This one, the law against the formation of political parties, which means that Germany now is a one party state. It is now illegal for political opposition in Germany. And then they have a national election, and the Nazis win with 95% of the popular vote. You could only vote for the Nazi Party, so little wonder they win the election, but they wanted to give the appearance of credibility, of legitimacy. They want to be able to say, hey, look, the people chose us in a democratic election. But the result was a foregone conclusion. Like, of course, the Nazis are going to win. In December of 33, another law, this one the law safeguarding the unity of party and state. They couldn't think of a longer term. This law puts the Nazis above the rule of law, and it creates the Third Reich. A Reich is a German empire. So the First Reich was when Charlemagne united the Germanic tribes way back when. The Second Reich Empire was when Bismarck unified Germany in 1871. This is the Third Year Reich, or the Thousand-Year Reich, as they like to sell it. It's only going to last 12 years. In June of 34 now, we skip ahead to the next year, the Night of the Long Knives. He eliminates his SA, his stormtroopers, and he replaces them with the SS. You've probably seen characters in movies with these two lightning bolts on their lapels. That is the SS. That is his new inner circle, um, his elite um, guard. Later on, after the Holocaust is uncovered, a lot of Germans were able to say, look, I didn't know. and a lot of them wouldn't have known. The SS would surely have known because they were the ones doing it. We'll come back and talk about those guys later, but that's his new inner circle. In August of 34, he takes on the title the Fuhrer, the leader. You've probably seen that in movies too. And then in the fall of 35, a big one, the Nuremberg race laws are passed. And what they do is they legally strip Jews of their citizenship in Germany. They forbid marriage between Jews and non Jews. Jews are not allowed to own private property. Again, he's focusing discontent, and they begin to toy with the idea of eugenics, creating that master race that you've heard about and seen on TV and movies and things like that. This is a big point in history because the Jews legally now are not citizens. They don't get rights and freedoms from this point beyond because they're not considered citizens. So if I'm examining what can go wrong under totalitarianism, I would point to laws like this that put the Nazis above the law, that remove political opposition. And I would also be taking a good look at the Nuremberg laws and saying, look, totalitarianism is not a good idea. Look what it can do to marginalize groups in your society. In November of 38, there's Kristallnacht, which happens in Austria. It's more of a 20-1 thing, but in one night in Austria, they go ballistic and they burn down synagogues, they vandalize Jewish stores as one further example of a government-sponsored pogrom, attacking, going after, bullying Jews. And then you can see the culmination of events that lead to World War II. They take Czechoslovakia, they invade Poland, and that triggers World War II. Um, so if totalitarianism wasn't bad enough in terms of what was going on in Germany, you could argue that it spread outside the borders of Germany and helped cause World War II, which was catastrophic. I mean, almost 100 million people died in World War II, many of them civilians, in fact, most of them civilians, and that war cost well over $1 trillion. Here's a diagram showing you the Nuremberg laws. So they were laws that they did a few things. They scapegoated the Jews, they stripped Jews of their citizenship, but they also labeled who, in fact, was a Jew. And so, in looking at this diagram, if all four of your grandparents were of Germanic descent, you were considered of pure German blood. And the world would basically have been your oyster in Germany. If you had three or more Jewish grandparents, you were considered a Jew. And then the Nuremberg race laws would have been applied to you and your family. If you were somewhere in the middle, if you had one or two Germanic grandparents, you were a Mischling, mixed blood. And your life was better than the Jews would have been, but not as good as the full-blooded Germans would have been. So this is a very elitist and hierarchical society. A lot of people, Jews in particular, if you were able to, you would buy fake ID, fake family backgrounds to buy yourself and your family some extra time as they begin to persecute you as a Jew in Germany at that time. As soon as you're building race laws, your society's in trouble. I could think of 6 reasons as to why liberalism was rejected in Germany. Number one, they had always been an historical monarchy. They didn't want democracy. So when they were force-fed the Weimar Republic, no wonder they hated it. They didn't want it. They were content with the monarchy, Wilhelm I and Wilhelm II. Proportional representation. We look a bit more at this in Chapter 10, but if you think back to that election result in 1928, they only got about, I think it was 2.6% of the popular vote. While that would seem like nothing, it actually amounts to a couple of seats in the German Riksdag, their parliament. Um, they do have a political voice, even though they only got 2.6% of the vote. In Canada, we don't use proportional representation. Um, in Canada, if you got 2.6% of the national vote, you probably wouldn't get a single seat in our House of Commons. different underproportional representation. And so that 2.6% amounted to a couple of seats and gave them something to build on rather than being shut out politically. The Weimar Republic was notoriously weak. Um, Within 10 years, they go through, uh, I think, almost 20 different governments. I mean, basically, they're having an election almost twice a year. So it led to political disunity that the Nazis took advantage of. Disunity among the left. This is an interesting one, too. In Germany at that time, you had the Nazis that are far right, way over here. And you can either vote for them. There were political alternatives before, don't forget, before the Enabling Act. And there were a series of left wing options that the Germans could have voted for. There were a few of them, in fact. Problem was, they all wanted different things. And what happened was, rather than uniting together in one single political voice, these parties remained separate, and what they did was they split the vote among them. There were several of them. What they should have done was amalgamated into one left-wing political choice, but they kept separate and split up the vote among the political alternatives, which helped the Nazis win the election that came in the 1930s. Hostility to democracy. To a lot of Germans, whenever they thought of democracy, it reminded them of the Weimar Republic. It reminded them of the Treaty of Versailles, which they hated, so they never gave it a chance. And finally, this is the midst of the Great Depression. There's economic chaos coupled with the political chaos. Um, there was your crisis theory um, right in front of you. That's why liberalism was rejected. That's why the Nazis were able to rise to power when they did. Finally, when we evaluate the rejection of liberalism, understand that it's attractive in some ways, in that if you seize power as a centralized totalitarian government, you can build a strong military. You can defend yourself, and that's just what Germany does. Germany is the first country out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. They do it by building their military. You need a job, you come and work for the Nazi government, and you build tanks, and you build planes, and you build munitions, and we'll accomplish two goals. Number one, we'll give you a job, get the economy going again, and number two, we will remilitarize. So very quickly, they've got thousands of planes, they rebuild their navy, they rebuild their army, and they get the economy going, and they build a strong military. And with that strong military, you can also expand. You can expand your boundaries, your borders. So in case of Germany, they take Czechoslovakia, they unify Anschluss with Austria, they invade Poland. At one point in time, they will control pretty much all of Western Europe. Economic prosperity. Um, Germany economically enjoyed a good decade in the 1930s. Hitler stopped paying reparations on the Treaty of Versailles in 1933, and Germany restored its economy by the end of that year, and most Germans were economically prosperous. Again, there's your great man theory. It seemed like a good idea, and he gave them back their pride. Tore up the Treaty of Versailles, refused to keep paying it, remilitarized, and gave Germans back their sense of pride. So there were some advantages, I guess, that went with rejecting liberalism in Germany, but there was a dark side too. The expansionist policies of the Nazis led to World War II, destabilized Europe politically for years after. Almost 100 million people died, most of them civilians. Trillions of dollars were spent on the war that could have been spent on education, healthcare, and so on. And in the end, Germany lost World War II anyway. Um, so by April of 45, Hitler had killed himself. By May of 45, Germany officially surrendered, was split in two. Half of Germany was occupied by the Americans, the British, and the French. The other half of Germany was occupied by the Soviets. So whatever short-term gain Germany experienced, it didn't last long. And then in many ways, life was worse for them after World War II than it was leading up to World War II. So a strong argument against totalitarianism. The Nuremberg laws were horrific. to the Jews. Anytime you pass a law that legally strips someone of their rights and freedoms, that will result in horror. And as we're going to learn, in this case, the Nuremberg laws politically and economically marginalize the Jews. And then they're eventually ghettoized by the Nazis. And after that, they are victims of the Holocaust, which, as you know, is the murder of 6 million Jews and 5 million other people in Germany and Western and Eastern Europe. So the Nuremberg laws were bad enough, but they would give rise to the Holocaust, which is even worse, the mass murder of millions of people. And like I said earlier, in the end, Germany was defeated anyway. The Thousand-Year Reich really only lasted for a dozen years. So it's not a strong argument in favor of a totalitarian regime. We'll study that later. Okay, I hope this helped you understand totalitarianism better. You see the risks involved with it and what it could mean to democracy and liberalism when a nation falls victim to totalitarianism.